Hi, Congressman Murphy. Thank you so much for sitting down with us today to talk about your work with Veterans Capitol Police and your recent book, The Christ Cure.
Great to be with you. Thank you so much. Real honor.
Let's start off. Can you just please introduce yourself to our audience, talk a little bit about your time in Congress, as well as your professional training in psychology?
Sure. I was a member of Congress elected 8 times, representing southwestern Pennsylvania, the 18th Congressional District. Before that, I was a state senator, elected twice there in the state of Pennsylvania. So my part of the state is the southwest corner of the states, a suburb south of Pittsburgh. Also did 8 years in the Navy. While I was in Congress, 8 years in the Navy Reserve Medical Service Corps as a psychologist.
That's an impressive resume. What got you into the field of psychology and specifically in your specialty trauma recovery?
It's something I majored in college, got my doctorate from the University of Pittsburgh, and practiced for a while with that. It was from psychology that really motivated me to run the first time for the state Senate because I was very interested in healthcare reform. I was recognizing at that time problems with managed care and insurance and ran on that platform, worked on some reforms there. And as I saw things happening in Congress with the need to work on healthcare in general, but mental health in specific, because there was no real champion of mental health who also had the mental health background. It's one of those things, when you're called, you go. And so it was interesting times. We had a lot of battles on this, but made a lot of tremendous progress in the field of healthcare and mental health care.
Can you give an example of one of your accomplishments in mental health?
Sure. It actually turned out to be what Tom Insel, who at that time was the head of the National Institute of Mental Health, said our legislation, called the Helping Families in Mental Health Crisis Act, was the most significant mental health reform legislation to come out of Congress in 50 years, and perhaps even for a century. What happened was the layout of what was happening in mental health in America is we have too few providers. We have growing problems with mental illness, with depression and anxiety in particular. In fact, over the last few years, post-COVID, there's been huge increases among adolescents and young adults, although across the board is large increases in drug overdose, drug addiction, suicide rates. But the key things that we saw was the federal government was actually standing in the way of progress in several things. One, people who are severely mentally ill, and here I'm talking about people with schizophrenia or severe bipolar disease, brain-like diseases, which can be debilitating to people, absolutely debilitating. And the way things have happened historically is for a long time, such persons were actually part of the families and then on the streets. And in the 1800s, many times in prisons, chained to walls, abused, abandoned. Along comes a woman by the name of Dorothea Dix, and she campaigned in the United States to open a number of homes, small institutions, sanitariums, and asylums that were there to provide comfort for people who were severely mentally ill. And that went on for a number of decades, but a couple of problems occurred. One, we didn't have medications to treat it. Two, sometimes they became dumping grounds for family members, just get rid of uncle or grandpa or something like that. And three, when World War II came around, we lost the doctors and nurses who were there caring for people. So other people came in, I'm sure many of them were caring, but they became centers that became hugely overcrowded. Maybe a home that was built for 500 people became a place for 2,000 people, overcrowded, very expensive. In the 1980s, what happened in California was a movement by which, I guess the perfect storm, the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, was campaigning to say, we need to shut these down because they're unfair and they put people in for treatment without real diagnosis. You had another side, people saying these are too expensive, we shouldn't be having these. And at that, in 1963, the last bill that John Kennedy signed as president was actually to move towards community mental health systems. It took a while to get that going, but the idea was have availability in the community, but shut these hospitals down. So the federal government also had a bill that said, in order to help shut these hospitals down, they said you cannot have a hospital with more than 16 beds in it. Understand, some had thousands of beds. In the 1950s, we had 550,000 psychiatric hospital beds. Now, keep in mind, at that time, the population in the United States was 120 million. Now we're almost 3 times that size, and the number of hospital beds we have is a little over 30,000, nowhere near enough. So what happens to these people? You can see them all the time if you drive through any city and you see people on the streets, the homeless. They fill our prisons. Most people in prison have a mental illness. Many people with severe mental illness, such as schizophrenia, are seen more by the police than they are by doctors. And we don't even have enough doctors, trained psychiatrists, psychologists who deal with the severely mentally ill. And in trying to get more help for them, we ran into a couple of things. One, the federal agency called SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration. At that time, I was chairman of Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee in the Committee on Energy and Commerce, so we had jurisdiction. So I had SAMHSA come before me, and we were asking them a number of questions. And as it turns out, in their annual report, they did not even mention the word schizophrenia, not even once. And many of their programs had to do with helping people with stress and other problems. Well, it's not up to federal agencies to help people with stress. In fact, it was teaching them how to make a fruit smoothie when they're stressed, or making up sing-along songs, or they spent $25,000 on a painting of people sitting in a circle for mental health awareness. And the awareness we had was it was a waste of money. And they really weren't putting money into treatment. They were putting a lot into prevention. We didn't know what they were preventing. So we had legislation that did a number of things. One, we wanted to lift the cap on hospital beds. Two, we wanted to put more money to help there being more mental health professionals to treat people. And that was to say, we were even willing to help pay off their student loans. Three, we wanted to revise SAMHSA and create the title of the Assistant Secretary of Mental Health, who would be the head of that agency. We also wanted to work on some other aspects too, to help with what's called AOT, Assistant Outpatient Treatment, where people would be compelled by a judge, if necessary, to get treatment. The reason that is so necessary is because people with severe mental illness, many of them, over half, have a condition called anosognosia. Big word. What it means is they are not aware that they have a problem. So much like a person with Alzheimer's disease is not aware, and they're not even aware that they're not aware, a person who's hallucinating, delusional, thinks the FBI is after them, hearing voices, etc., they don't know that this is happening to them. And so when they're approaching saying, you want to get treatment and see if we can stop these things, they may be paranoid and think, well, you're just part of this, maybe trying to take me to another planet, and maybe the CIA is planting things in my mind, all the things that go with severe, painful delusions. And then if they're approached by police, they may react violently. If police are not trained how to calm them down. So we also wanted to, so the AOT is something where say, no, judge can say, you need to be in treatment, take your medication, get some help, and people, many of them get much, much better. But when we leave it up to them and say, well, they don't want to get help, it is a bizarre thing. So I think those people have good intent in their heart. They don't want to force people into treatment. But think of it this way. If grandma, 80-year-old, was walking down the streets of a city in January, wearing her robe, bare feet, and said, I have to get ready for school, we would know there's something wrong with her. No one would say, do you want to stay out here in the street or do you want to go to the hospital? They would take her because they understand her brain is not working right. The same goes for many people who are mentally ill. And what else do they do? Many of them will self-medicate with alcohol, with drugs. If you look at a lot of the folks who are homeless, taking a lot of street drugs, they're trying to calm down their hallucinations and delusions. But if they do get picked up by the police, they get in a fight, get in a tussle, maybe they're picked up for stealing from a store. If they're not in treatment, and most people who then go to jail do not get treatment or medication, they're not assessed, they sit there, they can become more agitated because the brain is actually deteriorating more and more with it. So they end up with another crime. They may get in a fight with a guard, and now they have a sentence that goes longer. What started as a misdemeanor can end up as a felony. So I believe very much that we needed to have sometimes where we had these other aspects there. Well, that became a political battle in Congress. And some of the things we tried to do, like have more hospital beds, the Congressional Budget Office said, oh, that's going to cost too much money because everybody's going to put everybody in a hospital. Well, people need to understand that when we go to the Congressional Budget Office, they assign a score to a bill. Here's how much it's going to cost. They said over 10 years, this bill will cost $60 billion. Well, I reflect back on third grade where the teacher says, show your work. So I said to the CBO, where do you come up with that number? And they said, we just think everybody's going to go in a hospital. Well, that was ridiculous, but they revised it to $1 billion a year. But at that time, we had to have an offset. If it's going to cost $1 billion, we had to come up with $1 billion somewhere else. We couldn't do that. So it ends up that the hospital bed cap, we didn't manage at that time. We didn't get funding for more doctors and nurses. We did get the revisions done at SAMHSA agency. We got a lot of stuff done in that bill. And it's just one of the great accomplishments. Didn't get everything we needed, but we needed everything we got, and a lot left over, which Congress has actually dealt with since I left. So it was important, but it's not enough. And so we still, as you know, have many people languishing with mental illness from mild to severe. We're not putting enough into that. And it is not enough just to have ads on TV that say, go get help. People have to know where they're getting help. And this is where we have to continue this push.
Well, thank you for sharing that history and the accomplishments you helped not only sign into law or sign into reality while you were in Congress, but move forward into a movement. Additionally, you talked a little bit about this bill, which applies to the general populace of America, but recently your work has focused on veterans and especially Capitol Hill police officers as well. Can you talk a little bit about what inspired you to kind of lean into these groups and look into their mental health a little bit more?
Sure. Thank you for asking. That's a real important topic because we know the Capitol Police are there to protect the Capitol and the members. But these are folks who I understand they're getting threats all the time, terror threats, demonstrators coming by. It's a daily thing for them. I was at the Capitol yesterday and it was one of those things, thanking them and saying, how was the day? This is great. It's a quiet day. They want quiet days. But what happens is they face a lot of trauma. There have been times when someone may drives through a barrier with a car, brings in a gun. There's been Capitol Police have been shot. There's demonstrators can start to push their way towards the Capitol. I remember once during a vote, I saw coming up Independence Avenue, there was one group of disabled people who were demonstrating for their cause. There's a group of people demonstrating on immigrant issues and a group of people demonstrating on health issues. Great, all of them have a right to free speech and a right to assembly. No conflicts there, but police have to always be aware because sometimes people try and force themselves in a building. But here's what happens. Particularly after January 6th, not taking a position on January 6th, but there was a lot of trauma that occurred to police officers. And at that time, there really wasn't really access to a mental health system for the Capitol Police. So I was asked to come in and do some training for them and teach them about what they need to do to build their resilience and how to handle their own recovery from trauma. I mean, there was a police officer that died of suicide. There was many who were injured. One officer candidly said to me, he says, we're being whipsawed by threats and politics, that each side is trying to use them. And that's really unfair. They're just there. As this officer said to me, we're just trying to save your lives. We're just trying to keep the government going. But it's the pressure is not right. So I went in and did a couple of days training with them and teach them about this, about what they needed to do in their own lives, how they, even basic things which you forget about, getting enough sleep, eating the right food, exercising every day, spending time calming themselves. I'm a big believer that having a strong faith is an important part of that too. So working with chaplains within the, and pastors within the Capitol that can help with the Capitol Police. And that's important. Now I should add to that too, because you asked me earlier about my interest in trauma. While serving in Congress, in 2005, visiting Iraq, I was in a rollover accident. Dubious to say, I think I was the only member of Congress injured in the war. But injured from that and ended up going to hospitals in Baghdad and Balad and then flighted up to Germany. Luckily, my injuries, although very painful and took some recovery time, nothing compared to what other people face. But I got to see firsthand the wounded in Iraq and over in Germany and seeing how brutal it was. And I felt, here I am voting to send people to war. I had to be helping out as a psychologist. And at that time, Admiral Mullen, Mike Mullen, was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I happened to be at a dinner with him. We talked at the table and I said, I would join if they would take me. And he said, we'll take you. And 9 months later, I'm on the hangar deck of the USS Eisenhower, taking the oath of office, becoming a Navy officer. And then for years, I worked at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, Bethesda, on a unit treating post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury. Phenomenal times. I met some great people. I met true heroes there, but really became more and more interested in treating trauma and PTSD and recognizing there's a lot we don't understand. The VA doesn't take care of it all. There's 20 million, well now it's 18 million or 16 million veterans, but only a fraction of those use the VA system. And many of them don't want to, or they're too far away, or they struggle with it. In fact, there's 40,000 different organizations in the United States to offer veteran support. That should tell you some idea. The VA is not doing the whole job. But I love that. But studying more and more, when I retired from Congress, I went back to my practice as a psychologist and founded a organization called Fortis. Fortis is a Latin word for strong. And our symbol is a tree that's been cut down, but the branches are coming back stronger. And we treat veterans and first responders, policemen, firemen, paramedics with post-traumatic stress disorder. And so I love helping them. I love seeing them recover. I think that it helps them that I served in the Navy, so I have some sense of some, at least I've not been in combat, but some sense of the military aspects too. And I really want to continue to help them, and that's my mission now, to help turn their lives around.
But speaking of the VA and your work with veterans, you recently wrote an article talking about the VA and your recent discovery that they are undercounting veteran suicides. How did you come upon this realization, and what steps should the VA be taking to rectify this mistake?
This is powerful news. You know, I know it makes the news when congressmen fight with each other, congresswomen fight with each other, and whether or not they can pass budgets or pass bills. This is hidden away somewhere. But on an annual basis, the Veterans Administration puts out a report about veteran suicide, September being Suicide Prevention and Awareness Month. So I was reading the report, the 2021 report, which gives data from 2019. And you probably heard the numbers, that the number of veteran suicides a day is 22. A lot of organizations call themselves 22 because they want to help reduce veteran suicides. Well, in that report, it said the veteran suicides was only 17 per day. Wow, this is a big decline. And I know the VA, what, $235 billion budget, was saying they have grant programs, other things. They thought it was helpful. But I said, something doesn't really seem right here. So I looked to see where they got their sampling groups from. And it was in 2019, they changed it to stop counting National Guard and Reserve. The National Guard being Army and Air Force National Guard, and Reserve being Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, Reserve. Now, here is their rationale. In order to be eligible for veterans benefits, like going to veterans hospitals, being buried in a veterans cemetery, even getting a flag for your casket when you die, you have to have served 90 consecutive days of active duty, or 30 days in a combat zone, or serve 20 years. If you don't meet those criteria, you can't do it. I served 8 years, Navy Reserve, was not deployed in a war zone for 30 days, and didn't serve 90 days active duty. So if I go into a veterans hospital, I can stop at the coffee shop on the first floor. That's as far as I can go. Now, what I thought was terribly unfair about this was that we've seen increased rates of suicide among military. The last couple of years, the highest it's ever been. It declined slightly last year. But the National Guard and the Reserve actually have a high suicide rate as well, for a couple of reasons. One is they're not part of a team every day. They train for 10 weeks of in boot camp, come back every month for a couple more days of training. But they maintain their full-time job, their family, whatever else they're doing in the community. And they're always referred to as twice a citizen, because they bring all these skills into their military service. Someone's a police officer during the day, they come back to serve as a police officer in the military. They're bringing a lot of skills into that. Well, the thing that goes on with this is also, if someone is very depressed and down, Guard and Reserve have access to guns at home. And in a suicide attempt, use of a gun is a lot more lethal than drugs or something like that. So to cut out the Guard and the Reserve just doesn't make sense to me, because they do have high suicide rates. And basically the message is, we're not going to count you. We don't care. Now, there's two kinds of veterans. There's veterans with benefits and veterans without benefits. But my belief is, you put that uniform on, you take the oath, whether or not you are called up, you're still a veteran at the end of your service. The VA doesn't see it that way. Now, here's another way of looking at that. If you had your money invested in something for your retirement, and you go to talk to your investment counselor, and he says, oh, look, you get 20% gain in your income this year. Well, how could that be? The stock market's been kind of flat. Oh, well, we just decided we're not going to count the stocks we don't like. Anything that lost money, we're not going to count them. But that doesn't make sense. Shouldn't you put them all in? No, we want to make it look like we're really doing a good job. And you would think that financial counselor's not telling me the truth. Well, what I see is the VA either intentionally to try and make themselves look better, or just a disrespect for veterans, cherry-picked data. We need to look at every single death, even if it's just one a year. Every single death is meaningful. And if you include Guard and Reserve, that's a perfect comparison group, a control group, as it were, to say, well, here is people who never were deployed. Are they different from those who were deployed? Here's people who served many years, but they weren't on a base every day, or didn't serve 90 consecutive days. Is their suicide rate different? Well, here's a built-in group to compare with, but the VA says we're going to ignore them. Two other groups that are important to understand: those who are dishonorably discharged also were not eligible for veteran services. Now, here's the thing about that. Why were they discharged? If they were discharged because they were insubordinate, getting in fights, doing wrong things, that's one thing. But a person, for example, who has PTSD is 11 times more likely to engage in some behavior problems in the military. And the question is, what were those behavior problems? Were they, if it's something related to military service, they had a dishonorable discharge, whatever it is, another group we ought to compare. What is their suicide rate like? And it is high. But by pulling that data out, you're also suppressing the numbers. So I believe they should also be counted. They may not qualify for benefits, but you should count them and find out why. A third group, there was a group out called Operation Deep Dive. It was their study. And they said, we also need to count the deaths that we're not sure are suicide. Just because someone didn't leave a note or tell someone doesn't mean it wasn't a suicide. So if you have a veteran that suddenly took all of their prescribed medication, looks like a suicide. If you have someone who overdosed on drugs, is that a suicide? If you have someone who's riding their motorcycle down the interstate, 120 miles an hour at 3 in the morning, they crash into a bridge, was that a suicide intent? If you have someone who shoots themselves, is that a suicide, even if there's no note? Well, it depends on what the coroner puts down. If it says veteran on the death certificate and suicide, it may get counted. So this organization said they counted a lot of those, and they feel there's actually 40 veteran suicide deaths a day, and we need to pay attention to those. The VA says, no, we don't have to count those because we don't know if there's suicides or not. Well, go do the research, go find out. The way I look at this is we need to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly to find out what exactly is there. Because unless we measure it, you can't manage it. So let's find it all out. It may not be what we want to see, may not be what we want to hear, but then again, it is exactly what we want to hear because it gives us a direction of what we need to do. So my belief is to the VA, count them all. In fact, this article, which appeared in the American Spectator just a few days ago about veterans undercounting, I also put an important line there too, and that is that the VA has to give them a flag. They don't qualify for a flag for their casket. For goodness sakes, let all the veterans have a flag. If you can't do anything else, give them the stars and stripes as thanks for their service, and stop counting people that they don't count. I'm hoping this is going to take some legislative change. I believe Congress ought to take this up. I know some members are looking at its legislation, and I hope anybody watching this, including former members, will talk to members about this. Can we just stop this nonsense? This is one group we need to count. In a multi-trillion-dollar federal budget, with the VA with lots of money, count every veteran suicide.
Thank you, Congressman. And you just segued perfectly into my next question. What policy changes and investments do we need to make in mental health, both generally and specifically to veterans and police officers while in Congress?
Well, for veterans, I'm hoping that they will pass a bill that requires the VA to count all these. I know there was something in the National Defense Authorization Act that suggested it, but suggestions don't work. You got to say it must be done, and produce an annual report to Congress with all these things that's open to review and questioning by committee. For police, the pressure's been on them, a lot of political pressure off of George Floyd and other things, criticizing police for violence. Nobody wants police to do that, and the 1% that are engaged in that, a couple percent, they shouldn't be police officers. But there's a lot of things that can be done with more support for police, more training. I do believe that sometimes it's helpful to have mental health personnel engaged in an incident where they know the person is mentally ill and having some troubles, but you don't just send a car of social workers to events where someone is violent. You still need police. There's something called crisis intervention training where police officers can have this. I believe that should be something supplied to every police officer in the United States, how to handle these crisis situations. Some officers will get it, some not, depending upon what their captain or their sheriff wants them to do. I believe it should be required, and funding should be in place for that. For the general population for mental health, we do need more providers. We need a spectrum of providers too. We need providers who are psychologists and psychiatrists and nurse practitioners. But a lot of those folks now are dealing with mild problems. The worried well, mild anxiety, mild depression. We need people who are really going to specialize in severely mentally ill. Again, keep in mind, most of the people in our prison have mental illness. We're talking about, for the population of people with schizophrenia, about 1.2% of the population, but they make up a larger percent in our jails. And I should say this, I work with an organization called Schizophrenia and Psychosis Alliance. And We did a study a couple years ago for the year 2020, and we wanted to do a cost analysis of what it costs for schizophrenia, and found in the year 2020, the cost, including direct care, indirect medical care, because people with severe mental illness also have a wide range of other illnesses, diabetes, heart disease, lung disease. Also, criminal justice system, which is a massive number, out-of-pocket costs for families, a host of other things. And what we found is the cost in 1 year for schizophrenia was $282 billion. Now, go back to what I said earlier in the program, where I said we couldn't get Congress to kick in $1 billion a year, one versus 282. So the idea of saying, well, you have to offset it somewhere, it says, look, the prevention money is massive. Look what cities spend or actually ignore for the homeless. Look what cities and counties and parishes spend on prisons, and state spends on prisons. That's inhumane. We shouldn't be doing that. Actually, we've gone back to the 1800s and just locking people in jails, putting them in solitary confinement, letting them rot away. It's inhumane. It's wrong. So spend the money on more providers who specialize in this. Medicare rates have to have a better reimbursement rate, because a lot of doctors cannot pay even their rent if they're getting paid $30, $35 an hour, and their costs exceed that. So Congress needs to step up and do that. We have lots of data. We'll continue to push for that. But it's one of those things that I believe that whether you're looking at compassion or politics, it's the right thing to do. But we have to have more people step up to do it.
It's a powerful message, Congressman. Thank you for sharing. I also want to touch on your recent book, The Christ Cure, which focuses on how to use faith to move past and survive traumas. What is the most important message you want readers to take away from your book?
Well, we have a lot of science about trauma and a lot of different things that are done with counseling and medication. But if counseling and medication was enough, we wouldn't have the problems we have. And I think 2/3 of those who have gone through treatment for PTSD continue to have significant symptoms 2 years later. We do know that faith is an important part of the healing process, but a lot of therapists, counselors, either themselves, they say, let's not talk about faith in the office, or they may not be believers. But research tells us that those who have a strong faith get better. Their prognosis is much better. And I'm a believer that you should ask people, just like, where do you live? Do you have proper housing? Do you have proper support? Do you have proper income? Do you belong to a church? Do you have faith? Are you practicing in that religion? Those are important aspects, but people figure, if my doctor's not asking me about that, maybe I'm not supposed to talk about it. Well, look, we've all had problems in life. I've had my own more than my share. And I decided to look at reading the Bible more. And I looked at the life of the Apostle Paul. Now, you would think of this guy's traumas. Here was a guy that was an absolute fervent Jew, believed very much in his faith, and would find people at that time who were followers of Jesus and says, they're blasphemers. We have to stop them. Imprisoned, some were killed. There was this thing called the Damascus moment in Paul's history, bright light. He heard the voice, says, why are you persecuting me? He changed his faith, believed in Jesus as a Messiah, and spent the rest of his life working that, oftentimes run out of town, beaten with rods 3 times, whipped 39 lashes 5 times, imprisoned for a few years. He was in a shipwreck, 14 days floating around the Mediterranean Sea in a ship that was falling apart, floating on a piece of wood for a day and a half, bitten by a poisonous snake. And I'm just beginning to mention what happened to him. He talked about being robbed and hungry. So I'm thinking, here's a guy who should have had severe PTSD. So I'm reading all these things he wrote in the Bible, all these historical documents. He didn't have the symptoms. He wasn't suicidal. He wasn't alcoholic. He wasn't all these things. In fact, he actually talked about being stronger because of his trauma. So I said, well, there's got to be a book about this. Well, it turns out no one wrote a book about it. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll try. And so I started. Now, I'll be honest with you, I'm not a biblical scholar. I didn't know what I was doing, but it just kept coming to me. So coming from this is a book called The Christ Cure, 10 Biblical Ways to Heal from Trauma, Tragedy, and PTSD. And I walk people through what I saw Paul doing in building a resilience before the battle, building your ability to resist in the battle, embracing your skills to recover after the battle, and then accepting faith and trust and grace to renew your life. Those make a big difference. And when I work with people, that's what it is. So my book, The Christ Cure, is out there. It's got some great reviews on Amazon and other places too. And I use it now as a guide when I'm working with my clients to help them get better. And I wrote it in such a way that even if a person is not a Christian, the stories in there about other people who've made huge change in their life, some of my own humble lessons, learned the hard way, and always backed up by the psychological science of how this is. So I'm excited about it. It's a way for people to heal and look at some things that many other people don't address. I refer to it as a handbook for the broken and the people who love them. And I also refer to it as it's a guide for clergy who need to know more about principles of counseling, and a guide for counselors who need to know more about principles of faith. So trying to help change how we approach PTSD using these things together with this handbook.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you for sharing your time with us. Thank you for sharing about your book, your article, your work. I've really enjoyed talking with you this afternoon. Before we finish up this interview, do you have any last words, any last messages you want to share with the audience today?
Yeah, I would say I have a website, drtimmurphy.com. That's drtimmurphy.com. And on there, I have some blogs. I have a number of posts there, and people can communicate with me through that, drtimmurphy.com. I also have podcasts I put out, and they're dealing with issues of building your psychological strength, many with themes of faith, where we're dealing with anything from strength and forgiveness and nutrition and sleep to a whole host of things. I hope people look at that too. The podcasts on Spotify and Rumble are a very unique name for the show, Dr. Tim Murphy. So it should be easy to remember. So there you go.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing that with us today, Congressman. I've had a pleasure speaking with you today, and I wish you a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you so much. Have a great day yourself. Blessings.